Hello and welcome to this week's edition of M's Kitchen. And tonight I'm going to be changing up all that sort of meat stuff, and I'm going to be doing a veggie or vegan friendly dish. So tonight we're going to be making a nice stew which is quite spicy and aromatic using seasonal ingredients. So this time of the year, the sort of seasonal ingredients that we've got quite a lot of are things like vine ripened tomatoes, eggplant or brinjals, those kind of things, more sort of autumnal type vegetables. So brinjals is lovely, and then you kind of think, oh, what am I going to do with it? So we do the sort of typical, sort of classical eggplant dishes, but sometimes it's quite nice to try something a little bit different. So this is something that I've made before, and I'll give you, as I talk you through it, I'll give you some options as to the different variations that you can try on this. But before I start, I'm going to be requiring about 2 cups full of tomatoes. If you can get fresh tomatoes, I would always recommend that, purely and simply because, especially if they've been ripened on a vine like this, the flavor is incredibly so much better than just those tomatoes that's, well, I don't know, ripened in warehouses, I suppose. So I buy these vine ripened tomatoes. They typically come from places like Spain, and obviously if you're in South Africa and stuff, you know, this is readily available. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the tomatoes and I'm just putting them in a pot because I want to blanch them. Now, if you've been watching my cooking thus far, you might have realized that I don't actually ever de-seed my tomatoes. And the reason I don't like doing that is because I actually like the texture of the seeds of tomatoes, and of course it's really good digestively. So all that I'm going to do, I'm just going to let them sit in boiling water for a couple of minutes. So what I've done is I've taken 2 eggplants. Eggplants, like I say, this time of the year, they're really widely available, and it's really, really nice to actually have this kind of a dish. So what I've done is I've just peeled them, and then I have chopped them, and I'm probably going to put this back in the oven, but just to show you really quickly, I've just covered this in a little bit of sunflower oil. You can use olive oil as well, and I'm just bringing them to a sort of soft state. I don't want them to brown particularly, I just kind of want them to roast a little bit. So literally I've peeled the eggplants. I've just used a knife to do that. I find it's much easier to peel eggplant using a knife rather than a potato peeler. I find that they don't work as well, and I'm sorry that my eyes are watering because of course I've got onions in my kitchen again, and for some reason, whatever onions these are, they tend to make me cry all the time these days. So I'm actually just going to move this away from my eyes for a bit. So I've just got 1 large brown onion, and all that I've done is I've taken the mandarin, and if you don't know what I'm talking about one of those, mandolin, not mandarin. I've taken a mandolin and I've just sliced them. And the reason I've done that is because the onions are making me cry constantly these days. It's just a way for me not to have really kind of irritated eyes. And then I've just taken a knife, and I quite like these types of knives because they don't blunt so easily. And I've just roughly chopped it. And I do mean roughly chopped. I don't want this as mush. I do like texture in this dish. So 2 cups equivalent of tomatoes. I've got 2 brinjals that I've peeled and cut into cubes and am now in the process of roasting. for about 15 to 20 minutes at 100, and you typically would use 180 degrees. My oven is really hot, so I reduce the heat to 165, otherwise I find that it burns. So the rest of the ingredients you can adapt depending on what's available in your cupboard. So you need the equivalent of 1 can of chickpeas. If you have raw chickpeas, you would need to soak this, preferably overnight, and then you'd also need to cook this. I've got the equivalent of 5 cloves of garlic that is just minced, so that just basically means that it's, you know, made smaller. I then have some tomato salsa because I've run out of tomato puree. So you need about 2 tablespoons full or 1 tablespoon of tomato puree, but I'm going to use the salsa because that's quite a spicy salsa, and it just gives a little bit of depth to the tomato. That's the only point. And if you're really in a situation where you haven't got tomato puree, you haven't got salsa like me, you can just use tomato sauce, because of course tomato sauce is concentrated tomatoes. And then I have got 1 teaspoon each of cayenne pepper and smoked paprika. You can get hot paprika now, so you can just use 2 teaspoons of hot paprika as well. Cayenne pepper, of course, is red pepper. That's just, so that's the sort of spicy bit. And then I've got the thing that I use in all my cooking. I've got some pink salt. You can also include something like dried mint, about a teaspoon's worth full, but I haven't got dried mint. I tend to use fresh mint if I can. But what I do have is I have got some coriander that's starting to go over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this, and right at the end I'm just going to chop this. So let's start. So what I've got is I've got those Brinjal's eggplant roasting, and I need to test that these tomatoes are ready to have their skins taken off. And what you do is, if you've got asbestos fingers, like people who work in kitchens all the time, now this heat doesn't bother them. But if you're someone like me and you don't always work in a kitchen, you do actually can probably do with using a knife. So top tip for if you are blanching tomatoes, start with the center like that and peel the skin away from there. Now if it's ready, this should be a fairly straightforward process. If it's not ready, it hasn't been in the hot water long enough, leave it in there for a little bit longer. And if you're in a hurry, really in a hurry, use a paring knife. Now, a paring knife is just a sharp knife like that. Okay? Don't use a steak knife or something like that. You do actually want to have a paring knife that is really hot. Okay, so I am going to use a spoon because I don't really want to be giving myself burns if I can help it. This is hot. So what you can do is, if this is bothering you, wear gloves or stick a fork in a tomato and peel it like that. But really, if you're working quite quickly, which is what I'm trying to do, this should be fairly straightforward. So in terms of methodology, start by doing the eggplant first. So peel the eggplant, get it in the oven at 180 degrees for 15-20 minutes. That gives you exactly how much time it's going to take you to prep all the other ingredients. So you can, of course, blanch the tomatoes sooner. The thing to remember, tomatoes are full of vitamin C. Okay, vitamin C is water soluble. So when you're putting your tomato in the water and you're chucking the water away, you are also chucking away all the vitamin C that the tomato contains, or a large percentage of it. So consider reusing the water, which is what I will do in this dish. So I'm just peeling these tomatoes, so equivalent of 2 cups full. This is a guesstimate. It's not exact science. I'm not going to do this. This isn't really the difference between cooking and baking, of course, is you can do cooking according to taste, and baking you have to kind of follow the process, otherwise it tends to, you know, things go wrong and your cakes don't rise and stuff like that. But cooking isn't like that at all. Cooking can be quite experimental, and you can just, you know, adapt this as is what is available in your cupboard. So I'm going to just put the water aside for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the tomatoes in this dish, because what I want to do is I want to just start sauteing the onions. And my hands are clean, but what I will do is I'll just rinse them in there rather than wash them in soap and then all that kind of stuff. I'm just trying to get some of the well, some of the bits from the tomato off my fingers. So I've got 1 tablespoon of just sunflower oil. Use olive oil if you want to. Use chili oil. You know, if you want to make this a little bit more, have some added dimensions, you can substitute it with something like a chili oil, a basil oil, all those kind of things. It's great garlic oils, all of those things. So if you are going to substitute, for example, the normal sunflower oil for something like a chili or a garlic oil, you don't need to then add more garlic unless you have to. Okay, so just remember, you've got to balance the flavors. You don't want it to be too overpowering. So I'm using a Bauer pan, preferably, because this is going to be on here for a little while. Try and get something with a fairly thick base. Because what tends to happen when something has got a thicker base, it takes longer to heat up, but it also kind of keeps the heat in for a little bit longer, and it's more consistent. So it's less likely to burn, so you get a better result. So really simply, this oil isn't hot enough, but I'm not browning the onions, I'm sauteing them. The difference is, sauteing means you just glaze, they go from sort of a white stage to an almost translucent stage. So very minor change from raw to glaze. It's not browned at all. So I'm literally roughly, and I do mean roughly, I'm cutting these tomatoes in half, and then I'm just slicing them and then cutting them into squares. All of this is going to cook right down, so you don't really need to worry about trying to make this small. It doesn't need to be small. It's going to disintegrate in the cooking process anyway. So just recapping, 2 cups full of tomato. So the onions are now starting to saute. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my wooden spoon and just give it a little stir. And the reason I do that is just, I don't want it to brown, I just want it to become translucent, saute, in other words. So again, I've just cut the tomatoes in half, and then I'm just cutting them into slices, and then cutting them into squares. And I'm just using this paring knife because there's no point in using 3 knives for the sake of it. There's no extra brownie points for creating as many dishes as possible. So this is probably a little bit more than 2 cups full of tomatoes. That's okay, because I'm now using all of these vine ripened tomatoes. If I wasn't going to use them, they'd probably end up rotting, and that would be a waste. So I'm using all of them effectively. So this should be pretty much ready now. What you can do is, at the stage where you add in the onions, you can also add in a little bit of pink salt. You don't have to do this at this point. It's just optional. You can add the salt later. This is a meat, so it doesn't really affect the taste very much at which point you actually add the salt. So now this is just combination, really simple. So all you need to do is you need to add all the rest of the ingredients. So in goes the chickpeas. So equivalent of 1 can of chickpeas. This is lazy garlic, which I hardly ever use. A little bit. And then I'm going to get my out. Okay. And now I need to just create a little bit of space so that I can transfer this. So the reason I put this onto foil, okay, because when you put stuff onto foil, you can just do stuff like that. And then again, it's one less dish for me to wash. Remember, this has actually come out of the oven, so it's fairly hot. Hang on 1 second. It is hot, so just be careful that you don't actually burn yourself. But you literally you should just be able to do that. So eggplant can stick. So all that needs to happen now is add, and I am not going to stir the eggplant into this. I'm just going to turn the heat right down to the lowest possible setting, and then I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of cayenne pepper and 1 teaspoon of paprika, smoked paprika. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, just put the lid on. Now I like to use one of these kind of steamer lids. So now what you need to do is this now just needs to simmer for 20 to 30 minutes. The water that you need to stop it from burning, I'm going to do this in about 5 minutes time. All that I'm going to do is I'm going to repurpose the water I used to blanch the tomatoes in. And so I've got this really clever, these great pots with these lids around the side. So put a cup underneath it or pour it straight from here. That way the skin stays in the pot, and you're putting as much vitamins as you possibly can back into the food without throwing it down the drain. So you can use 1 teaspoon's worth of mint as well, dried mint. You can use fresh mint. So remember, if you're using fresh, the difference between dried and fresh herbs always is that you use fresh stuff closer to the end, drier stuff you can use more towards the beginning. So anything like any green herbs, any kind of green stuff you use closer to the end, it usually only needs about 10 minutes. But anything else like paprika and salt and pepper and all that sort of stuff, kind of add that at the beginning. So as I said previously, it doesn't matter at what stage you actually add the salt. You only want a little bit of salt. You don't want this really salty, because you've got to remember brinjals, tomato puree, all those kind of things have got, tomato puree, and all processed foods typically tend to have salt in it. Okay, so always check, rather err on the side of caution. So for example, the chickpeas, for example, salt 0.02 grams. Okay, so it's got salt in there. If you look at the ingredients of the tomato paste, there'll be salt in there. There's salt in most things. So if you're trying to reduce the amount of salt in your diet, this is a really good way for you to do that. Just take the salt out. Don't add it in, because there's salt in the ingredients anyway. And if you really want to add it, then you can just add it towards the end. And you can add it to taste afterwards. So the difference between vegetables and meat is, of course, meat needs salt in the beginning, otherwise it tastes strange, but vegetables is not like that. So really, really simply, just to recap, 2 brinjals, sliced and diced. That just means cut them into cubes, squares, rectangles, whatever shape, triangles if you want them to be in that shape, but just make them smaller. Add a little bit. Now remember, eggplant's like a sponge, so what will happen is the eggplant will soak up all of that oil, and it will continue soaking it up. So just be mindful that you don't want to use a lot of oil. So I tend to, you can use, I'd say maximum about 1/4 of a cup. That's 1/4 of a cup is 80 mils on the thing. It's actually 65.7 or something like that. But anyway, so according to the measurements on the stuff, it says 80 mil for 1/4 cup of oil. You can use olive oil, you can have sunflower oil, you can use garlic oil, you can use any kind of oil that you want. Just coat the eggplant or the brinjal in the oil, put it in the oven as flat as possible, so lower the surface. Put that in the oven for 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the heat, at 180 degrees for about 15 minutes. And then in the time that it's actually in the oven, you make the rest of the stuff. So the rest of the stuff is the equivalent of 2 cups of tomatoes, chopped tomatoes. Fresh tomatoes always preferred. If you don't have fresh tomatoes, canned tomatoes, absolutely fine. Don't use the whole tomatoes. Try and get the chopped tomatoes. These days you also get chopped tomatoes with herbs in, with garlic in, whatever. So if you want to make this even easier, buy the one that comes with garlic and herbs. That way you don't have, that's half the ingredients from this recipe in the first place. I blanched the tomatoes and then I took their peels off, their skins off, and I'm reusing the water just to make sure that the dish doesn't burn. And then all that you need is 1 tablespoon of tomato puree. If you haven't got tomato puree, substitute it with tomato sauce, or like I did with spicy salsa. And then 1 teaspoon worth of smoked paprika, 1 teaspoon of cayenne pepper. You also get hot paprika now. So hot paprika, I am absolutely sure, will be fine as a substitute for both those things. So if you're only going to buy 1 spice and you haven't got either one of those things, just buy hot paprika and use 2 teaspoons. And then what you can also do is you can add 1 teaspoon of dried mint. But if you've got fresh mint, add it at the end. Don't add it in the beginning, because all that happens is that the flavor dissipates and you lose the point of it. I don't have mint because I use fresh mint always. I don't buy dried mint as a spice at all. I think it's a complete waste. But what I have got is I've got coriander, and coriander is one of my absolute favorite things. And not just because I make biltong, it's just I love the smell of coriander. It really lifts my mood. It makes me really happy on great days like this. So if it works, do it. So instead of chickpeas, what you can also do is you can take butter beans. So if you haven't got chickpeas in your cupboard, use butter beans. You can use the red kidney beans, but remember, if you are going to use red kidney beans, just rinse it under the water again, because it's got that really sort of starchy water, and it's quite difficult to get that off. And again, you can just get lentils. Lentils is what I tried the last time with this. Lentils is absolutely fab. I use the green ones, the vert ones, which just means green in French, and I just added in a cupful equivalent. So now this has been cooking down, and what you want, and what I want to show you, is this is not going to be staying red like this for a long time, I assure you. So I just want to kind of show you at this stage what that looks like. So I've got chickpeas in there, I've got tomatoes in there. So think about your 5-a-day vegetables. So I've got tomatoes in there, there's brinjal in there, onion, although onion isn't really a vegetable. So it's not a bad dish as dishes go. It's really, really simple to make. It's really tasty. I'm just reusing some of the water from the tomato skins. What I often also do is I don't take the skins off, if I'm perfectly honest, because I really like tomato skins. They don't bother me in the least, but some people don't like them. And if you really don't like tomato pips, again, you can remove them, but again, it's not necessary at all. This is a really, really simple recipe to make. Do try it. If you've got some, for example, I've got some peppers as well. You can also increase the amount of vegetables that you've got. Add some peppers into your dish. If you've got some baby marrow, add some baby marrow into your dish. Use the stuff that's hanging around your kitchen that's about to go over. This is the perfect kind of dish, and you can really increase the amount of vegetables in this dish. It's really, really tasty. It's kind of one of the things that you can make the night before, put it in the fridge, and then have it again the next day. It is like a curry. It absorbs all of those flavors overnight, and then you can just eat it the next day. So this is a meal in one. You don't need anything else to add to this. You can have this with couscous, you can have it with quinoa, you can have it with rice. You can just have this any way that you want. So that is our vegan recipe for this week. I will post some pictures. This doesn't have to cook for much longer. I'd say about maybe sort of 10-15 minutes. Thank you for watching as always, and see you in my kitchen next week. Take care. Bye-bye.